Brandon AIYUK is out there, and Mike Garafolo already reported Washington is watching. But what nobody is telling you is why that wait-and-see strategy might be the most expensive mistake Adam Peters makes this entire offseason. And I'm going to break it down for you right now. Because while Peters is playing the patience game on AIYUK, Darren Payne, the man who has been the anchor of this defense for 8 years, still has no contract. Bleacher Report put it in black and white this week. Locking him up is the single most important move Washington can make this offseason. I'll take it further. Not doing it would be the most avoidable mistake Peters has made since he walked through the doors in Ashburn. But there's something about that extension that ain't adding up, and I'm gonna show you exactly what it is. And then Nick Allegretti spoke this week and said the changes to this offense are the biggest he's seen since he's been on this team. Most people wrote it off as OTA hype. I read it different. Because if what Allegretti is describing is real, we're talking about a structural shift that could change everything Jaden Daniels does on Sundays in 2026. Raise hail, let's get into it. Okay, let's talk AIYUK honestly, because I've spent weeks hearing two extreme versions of this story, and neither one is complete. Version 1, Peters is a genius. He's patiently waiting for the 49ers to release AIYUK, which would let Washington sign him in free agency without giving up a single pick. Pure cap management intelligence. Version 2, Peters is being too passive, and while Washington waits, other NFC teams are going to step in and close that deal. The truth is somewhere between those two, but closer to the second one than the first. Here's why. First, the facts. Mike Garafolo reported that Washington is not actively pursuing a trade for AIYUK. They're monitoring. The bet is that San Francisco, given the broken relationship with their receiver, eventually decides to release him rather than absorb the distraction or pay trade compensation for a player who doesn't want to be there. If that happens, Washington signs him directly, no pick cost. In theory, that's brilliant. In practice, it has three massive problems that need to be named out loud. Problem 1, the 49ers finished 12-5 last season. 12 wins. They were a wild card team. They're not in rebuild mode where releasing a player like AIYUK for nothing makes sense from their front office perspective. Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch didn't get where they are by being sentimental, but they're also not the guys who give away first-level assets when there's no real pressure to do so. The pressure on San Francisco to actually cut AIYUK is much lower than the volume of media noise around this situation suggests. That means the scenario where Washington gets him for free might not happen, and if it doesn't happen, what does Peters do? Head into training camp with the same receiver room that finished 5-12. Problem 2, competition. Washington is not the only team watching this situation. There are at least 3 or 4 franchises in this league with real wide receiver needs following the exact same play. Some of them have more cap space than the Commanders, some have better picks to offer in a trade, and some have a more attractive team situation for a player who wants to win right now. If the 49ers decide to move him in a trade rather than release him, Washington is out of the conversation entirely because they refused to sit at the table when there was still a seat open. Problem 3, and this is the one that hits me hardest as a fan, the timing with Jaden Daniels. This is Daniels' second year. Let me be direct about this. Year 2 for a quarterback of his caliber is when the quality jump has to be visible, not just from him as a player, because Daniels has the talent to improve regardless of what surrounds him, but from the team as a unit. For Washington's offense to take the efficiency jump it needs to compete in the NFC, Daniels needs a receiver before the first game of the season who changes how opposing defensive coordinators think when they see your formation. What is a receiver who changes the defensive coordinator's thinking? It's someone who, when he's on the field in any formation, the free safety cannot stay in the box. He has to roll out wide because that receiver wins in single coverage when safety help is near the line of scrimmage. That creates space for the run game, for the slot receiver, for the tight end. A receiver who forces that structural adjustment is worth far more than his individual statistics because he makes everyone else's job easier. Does Washington have that right now without AIYUK? My honest answer is no, and Peters knows that. The question is whether he's willing to bet that the waiting strategy works, and if it doesn't, what's the alternative? Now, I don't want to dismiss the legitimate defense of this approach. Peters came from the Rams, an organization that's been methodical about asset management and doesn't overpay without reason. That culture has real merit. Overpaying in a trade for a receiver whose relationship with his previous team collapsed can wreck your cap space at the most critical point of a quarterback's rookie contract window. Every dollar Peters doesn't spend on trade compensation compensation is $1 available to extend Daniels when that time comes. To sign the pass rusher this team still needs, to fill the gaps still sitting on this roster. I understand the philosophy, I respect it. But here's the fundamental issue with applying it in this specific context. Jaden Daniels' window doesn't wait. His rookie contract has a timeline. The window isn't open forever. And if Peters gets to 2027 with a quarterback who wants an extension and a roster that still hasn't surrounded him with enough weapons, that conversation gets dramatically harder. My position is this: if the 49ers haven't released AIYUK in the next 3 weeks, Peters needs to enter the trade market. He needs to pay, not overpay, but pay. Because the opportunity cost of going into training camp without a true #1 receiver in 2026 is greater than the cost of a second-round pick. Keep it a buck. Second-round picks don't win Super Bowls. Receivers who change the offensive equation do. If the AIYUK topic is about whether Peters is going to take action, the Daron Payne topic is about why Peters hasn't taken the most obvious action of this entire offseason. Bleacher Report published this week, cited by Heavy, that extending Daron Payne is the most important move the Commanders can make right now. Not the most glamorous, not the most exciting for a YouTube thumbnail, the most important. And when a publication with Bleacher Report's reach puts an interior defensive tackle above every other offseason item, it's worth stopping and asking, why now? And why are they right? To understand the urgency, you have to understand who Daron Payne is and what he's meant to this franchise beyond the sack total on his stat line. Payne arrived as pick 13 in the 2018 draft. That's 8 years of being a Commander. 8 years during which this team cycled through 3 or 4 different regimes. Through seasons of institutional embarrassment, through the worst era of franchise management this organization has lived since the 90s. And Payne was here. He didn't leave. He didn't make public noise chasing a trade. He played, he kept being the professional coaches could put on the field on the most important down and trust to do his job. That has a value statistics don't capture. And now, at the moment this team is finally building something real with Adam Peters and Dan Quinn, the front office has an opportunity to tell Payne we're in this with you, and apparently they're taking longer than they should to have that conversation. Let me talk about what Payne actually does tactically, because the inconsistent player narrative is a superficial read that doesn't survive film analysis. Interior tackles in modern football are not primary sack producers. That's not the job. The job of an elite interior tackle in a 4-man defensive line is to make the opposing team's zone blocking impossible, collapse the A and B gaps before the running back sees the hole, and on passing downs, push the center and guard backward with enough force that the quarterback loses his throwing platform even when the sack doesn't get there. None of that shows up on the stats line. It shows up in the EPA of a defensive drive. It shows up in the third and short conversion percentage that the defense allows. Payne has been consistently good in those metrics in his strongest seasons. The problem is that in 2025, with the defense the Commanders had, which was genuinely bad as the 5-12 record demonstrates, the context around Payne didn't give him the structure to perform at the level he's capable of. A defense that gives up points easily is not a defense where the interior tackle shines. It's a defense where everyone syncs together. With Durante Jones arriving as the new coordinator, the relevant tactical question is whether Jones designs a scheme where the interior line is the primary pass rush weapon, or whether he leans more on blitz packages and second-level pressures. Because that decision directly affects how much Payne is worth in the new system. My read, and I don't have confirmation of this because Jones is still installing his system, is that a coordinator coming from San Francisco who was an assistant in an organization where DeMeco Ryans built pressure with 4 linemen as the base philosophy probably has a real appreciation for what Payne can give when the scheme opens the right lanes for him. That's not a guarantee. But the context suggests Payne can fit what Jones is trying to build. Now, the extension. Why hasn't it happened? There are 2 possible reasons, and neither is reassuring. First possibility, there's a number dispute. Payne wants more than Washington is prepared to pay. In the defensive tackle market, prices have climbed consistently over the last 2 free agency cycles. An interior tackle who can play multiple techniques and generate interior pressure on passing downs can ask for money that 5 years ago would have been unthinkable at this position. If Peters is trying to close that deal at 2023 prices in a 2026 market, that conversation goes nowhere. Second possibility, Peters is evaluating whether PAYNE is part of the long-term core or whether he prefers to use that cap space at positions with higher visible impact. And if that's the real reason, it's a strategic evaluation error. In the NFL, cap priority needs to reflect real on-field impact priority, not narrative impact priority. An interior tackle who stabilizes the defensive line interior is worth more to the win-loss record than a slot receiver who generates more headlines. What I know for certain, if PAYNE gets to training camp without an extension, the locker room dynamic shifts. Players notice when management doesn't resolve their contract situations. Noticing it doesn't mean they get distracted or perform below their ability. Professionals at that level don't work that way, but it does mean the conversation between PAYNE and his agent stops being about extending in Washington and starts being about what the open market offers when the season ends. And when that conversation starts, Peters loses the strongest negotiating position he currently holds: extend PAYNE. Now, not in 3 weeks, not after seeing how Jones's scheme looks in preseason, now before training camp makes everything more complicated. And we close with the story most people are sleeping on, which I think is, in terms of real on-field impact in 2026, potentially as significant as either of the other two. Nick Allegretti spoke with Heavy this week and described the changes in the Commanders' offense as the biggest he's seen since joining this team. Most people read that as generic OTA hype and moved on. I read it differently. Here's why it deserves real attention. Allegretti is an interior lineman. He plays guard. His work doesn't generate highlights, doesn't show up on the stats sheet, and only exists in media coverage when he commits a penalty or someone names him in an interview like this one. But the interior guard position is the one that most directly affects how the run game operates in the direction he's aligned, and the position from which the quarterback most immediately feels whether the protections are working or not. When an interior guard says something changed significantly in the offense, he's not talking about a cosmetic adjustment in the playbook terminology. He's talking about something that affects how he operates every single snap. What could that change be? I don't have the exact details, but the context offers clues worth exploring. In 2025, the Commanders' offense under Kingsbury had real consistency problems along the line. I'm not going to blame just the system, because the roster had limitations too, but there were repeated situations where Daniels absorbed pressure earlier than the play design should have allowed, where blocking assignments between the interior lineman and the center weren't always right against pressures opponents showed repeatedly through the season. That's not an individual talent problem, that's a schematic coordination problem about which protection you're calling and whether that protection is the right one for the defensive look you're seeing before the snap. If what Allegretti is describing involves a simplification or restructuring of the protection calls, giving the lineman a clearer system where assignments are more intuitive and require less verbal communication in the noise of a stadium, that's a change that can have immediate and measurable impact on the pressure rate Daniels absorbs, and that directly improves the efficiency of everything the offense does. There's another possibility that generates equal or more enthusiasm for me. The change is in the run blocking philosophy. In 2025, Washington ran with enough frequency to be defensible as a ground attack, but without the consistency of an offense that uses the run game as a structural threat that forces the opponent to adjust. If Kingsbury and the staff are installing a more robust run game system, with more variety in blocking concepts, with plays designed specifically around the attributes of the linemen they have on the roster, that change can transform how opponents prepare their defensive game plan against Washington. Why does the run game matter when Daniels can generate yards with his legs? Because there's an enormous difference between the run game that generates yards when Daniels scrambles and the run game that generates yards as part of the offensive design. The second one gives Daniels pre-snap options, the first one doesn't. It gives him credible play action. It gives him formations where the opponent can't deduce pass or run. It gives him time in the pocket because the safety has to respect the run threat. All of that adds up. Allegretti didn't give us the specifics, but the phrase he used, "the biggest change I've seen in this offense," comes from someone with enough time in this league to know the difference between a cosmetic change and something that genuinely redefines how you operate every Sunday. That interests me. I'll be watching very closely when training camp opens. The underlying question connecting all three stories today is this one. Peters is moving pieces, Quinn and the staff are installing new systems, and the defense has a new identity coming with Jones. But none of that matters if PAYNE walks without an extension, if AIYUK ends up on another NFC team, and if the offensive line starts training camp with questions about whether the change Allegretti is describing is real or June enthusiasm. The Commanders' offseason isn't over, and the decisions made in the next 3 weeks will say more about the real intentions of this franchise than everything that's happened since January. And look, I don't always love leaving these videos with open questions, but that's exactly where this offseason is right now. AIYUK is unresolved, PAYNE has no extension, and the offense is in the middle of a transition where we don't have the full picture yet. What we do have, and this is real, is a quarterback in Jaden Daniels, who's already shown he can compete in this league, a GM in Peters who has made more smart decisions than mistakes since arriving, and a head coach in Quinn who knows how to build a winning culture. This team came from 5-12, that hurts to say, and it's also true that the road from 5-12 to contender is not built in a single offseason. But it can be accelerated or slowed down depending on the decisions made right now. And what I'm seeing in these three stories, if you read them together honestly, is a front office at the right moment, but still with important items unresolved before camp opens. Raise hail, always. If this video gave you something, drop the like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me down in the comments. Would you wait for San Francisco to release AIYUK, or would you pull the trigger on the trade right now? And while you're at it, tell me what number you'd put on Darren Payne's extension. I want to read every single response. Burgundy and Gold, fam. See you in the next one.